The learning outcome of this video is for you to be able to compare the three types of experiments in psychological research. Experiment involves the manipulation of an independent variable or IV and measuring the outcome of the dependent variable or DV. This method is commonly used in quantitative research. The quantitative data collected are then analyzed using statistical analysis. We are going to discuss three types of experiments: lab experiment, field experiment, and quasi-experiment. Lab experiments are conducted in a highly controlled environment. The IV is directly manipulated by the researcher and the effect on the dependent variable is measured. Participants are randomly allocated to the conditions. Let's discuss the strengths and limitations of lab experiment. Regarding strengths, cause and effect between IV and DV can be inferred with reasonable confidence. Lab experiments have high control over extraneous variables, increasing the internal validity of the cause and effect relationship between the IV and the DV with little outside influence. Well-documented procedures and strict controls mean that the study can be replicated, and findings can be tested for reliability. As for the limitations, the highly controlled environment adds a level of artificiality to the research context that may cause participants to behave differently from their real-life behavior. Moreover, demand characteristics are as participants may look to both the researcher and the research situation for clues about how they are expected to behave. Lastly, it is not always practical or ethical to manipulate the IV. As for field experiments, they are often conducted in the real-world setting. Like a lab experiment, the IV is directly manipulated by the researcher and the effect on the dependent variable is measured, and participants can be randomly allocated to different conditions or groups. Now let's look into strengths and limitations of field experiments. Field experiments can infer cause and effect relationship between the IV and the DV, though this relationship can be diminished because it is harder to control extraneous variables in field settings. There tends to be higher ecological validity due to real-world environment, which means results can be generalized beyond the experimental setup. Because of the real-world setting, there is a lower demand characteristic because participants are less aware of the researcher. On the flip side, replication can be difficult as it is hard to capture to the exact same conditions. Thus, reliability can be challenged. Quasi-experiments are so named because the IV is not manipulated by the researcher. For example, in studying the effects of word learning in those with dyslexia and those without, the IV which is having dyslexia cannot be randomly assigned. Participants are not randomly allocated to conditions or groups. Next, let's consider the strengths and limitations. Quasi-experiments are useful in situations where it would be unethical to manipulate the IV, for example disorder or addiction. Or in situations where it would be impractical to manipulate the IV, for example gender, culture, or age. On the other hand, since participants cannot be randomly allocated to experimental conditions, the groups may not be comparable because the pre-existing differences making up the IV may be accompanied by confounding variables. This also means that quasi-experiment can only imply a causal relationship but cannot show a direct causation. To recap, these are the three common types of experiments in psychological research.